If you're like me, you probably didn't have a PC when San Andreas was in its prime, and if you did, you still probably played the game first on PS2. The difference between how the PS2 version looks and how the PC version looks can be quite staggering. On PS2, you start a new game and the first time you take control of CJ in the alley, you're greeted by this big California sunrise on an early morning. A lens flare comes from the sun and an orange haze covers the screen. It has this very warm West Coast style. But on PC, it's a little different. Instead, that big Californian sun is much smaller, and that iconic orange haze is missing. The warm tone of the game is instead much cooler. People have tried to replicate the PS2 graphics over the years by altering the weather settings, but the settings used on PC are nearly identical to the PS2 settings, so the issue was clearly with the engine. It wasn't until nearly 10 years after the release of San Andreas on PC when these graphics finally got restored. Welcome to the 5th episode of the San Andreas Mod Showroom, and today we're going to take a look at SkyGFX.
Oh shit, here we go again.
The main goal of SkyGFX was to restore the visuals seen in the PS2 version of San Andreas. That's where the name comes from. San Andreas is built on the Renderware engine, and the PS2 version of this engine was called Sky. And GFX obviously means graphics, so the name basically means PS2 graphics or Renderware PS2 graphics. But this mod does so much more than just restoring the PS2 graphics to the PC version. The mod has expanded massively since it began, allowing you to use different graphical effects from all the other 3D era GTA games. By default, SkyGFX uses PS2-like settings, bringing back a lot of the PS2 graphical effects, such as the iconic PS2 colours, the sun haze, PS2 vehicle rendering, and much more. But like I said, this mod is so much more than PS2 graphics. SkyGFX also allows you to use different graphical effects from all the other 3D era games, including the Stories games. For example, you can enable rain droplets that are only seen in the Xbox version of Vice City, or use vehicle reflections from Vice City Stories. SkyGFX also fixes 2D FX fog, which was in the PS2 version and completely broken on PC. We'll cover more of the changes and options SkyGFX offers once we install the mod, so let's do that now. Before we begin, if you're new to modding and not sure what you need or how to install mods, I have a beginner's guide that helps you install all the necessary things to have when modding San Andreas, so you should watch that guide before continuing. If you know how to install mods and didn't need my guide, this should be an easy install, so let's get to it. So step 1. Download SkyGFX from the link in the description. Step 2. Open your mod loader folder and create a new folder called SkyGFX. Step 3. Open the SkyGFX folder you just created and create a new folder called Data. Step 4. Go to your Downloads folder and open the archive you just downloaded. Open the folder within that archive and copy colorcycle.dat from the zip archive into the newly created data folder inside your SkyGFX folder. Step 5. Copy everything else except readme.txt and skygfx.dll from the archive into the SkyGFX folder. And now SkyGFX is installed. Let's dive into the configuration file, which hosts a range of options to tweak. So a few things before we start. A lot of the SkyGFX configuration options can actually be changed with the game running, allowing you to see changes as they happen. However, SkyGFX also supports debug menu, which allows you to edit a mod's configuration directly in-game if the mod supports it. I have another video on debug menu which I'd recommend you check out before continuing. SkyGFX contains 3 configuration files, each contain a different preset that mimics the graphics of other San Andreas versions. You can switch between these configuration files in-game by using the F10 key by default or again by debug menu. SkyGFX 1 is loaded by default and these settings mimic the PS2 version. SkyGFX 2 keeps the PC graphics, except it still has some graphical fixes that aren't seen in the vanilla PC game. And SkyGFX 3 mimics the mobile version of the game. I'm going to be editing SkyGFX 1.ini, as this is the one the game will use when you force launch. I'd recommend backing this file up before making any changes. When you make changes to the configuration file, you can press F11 in-game to reload it without having to exit the game. Not all options will support this behaviour though. To use the default PC setting for any of these options, you can simply comment them out, leave them blank, or remove them entirely from the ini file. One last thing before we start, SkyGFX contains a lot of options. There are 1 or 2 options that I won't cover, but they're not really important to the majority of people anyway. So if I don't cover an option, assume you don't need to touch it. So now that we've gone over all of that, let's cover some of the configuration options. PS2 Modulate. Texture modulation works differently on the PS2, causing the textures of grass, buildings and roads to be brighter than the PC version. This option allows you to switch between PC and PS2 texture modulation. I'd recommend leaving this on. Dual Pass. This option emulates the PS2 alpha test, which looks better than the PC version. Alpha textures are basically any textures that contain some sort of transparency, like the trees around San Andreas, where the issue on PC is most noticeable. Dual Pass will draw all transparent geometry twice as a way to emulate the PS2 alpha test, cleaning up a lot of the issues with alpha textures on San Andreas. I'd recommend leaving this on. Keep in mind, this option can have a bit of a performance impact, so if you have performance issues with this enabled, you can disable it. If you're taking screenshots, there's an option for Dual Pass that further improves the look of alphas. Further down the config file there's an option called Z-Write Threshold. By default it's commented out. If you uncomment this option and set the value to 255, this will basically eliminate the ugly alpha issues. But it can cause other issues such as coronas being visible through trees. For screenshots, I'd recommend leaving this at 255. Building Pipe. This allows you to use the building pipeline from the PS2 or Xbox version of the game. The PS2 pipeline is brighter, while the Xbox pipeline is as dark as the vanilla game when you have PS2 Modulate off. The only difference aside from lighting is a slight difference on buildings that use reflections. Both of these building pipelines also contain a smooth day and night cycle for models with pre-lighting. This is done with a vertex shader. In the vanilla game, the day and night cycle was done in steps, which look quite jarring. I'd recommend the Xbox setting. It makes the model slightly darker like it was in the vanilla game, but keeps the nicer grass colours found when using PS2 Modulate. I find the PS2 pipeline to be too bright, but it's completely up to you. Vehicle Pipe. The vehicle pipeline has a ton of options, so I won't recommend anything until I go through each pipeline and their individual options. PS2. This option aims to recreate the vehicle rendering seen on the PS2 version of San Andreas. It's recommended to use PS2 vehicles when using this pipeline. PC. This is simply the PC vehicle pipeline seen in the vanilla game. Xbox. This aims to recreate the vehicle rendering seen on the Xbox version of San Andreas. It's quite dark compared to all the other versions. Spec. This is very similar to the PS2 pipeline, however it also adds specular lighting to vehicles. Specular light is the white sheen that can be seen on the vehicle. I'd also recommend using PS2 vehicles if you're using this pipeline. Mobile. This aims to recreate the vehicle rendering seen on the mobile version of San Andreas. Neo. This aims to recreate the vehicle rendering seen on the Xbox version of GTA 3 and Vice City. This pipeline is called Neo because the original Xbox ports of GTA 3 and Vice City were done by Rockstar Vienna, which was a company formerly known as Neo Software. LCS. This aims to recreate the vehicle rendering seen in Liberty City Stories. VCS. This aims to recreate the vehicle rendering seen in Vice City Stories. ENV. This is similar to the Neo pipeline as far as I can tell. Keep in mind, several of these options also have additional options that allow you to tweak them further. So let's take a look at those too. ENV map size. This changes the resolution of the reflection map used for the mobile, Neo and ENV pipelines. The higher the value, the higher the resolution will be for reflections. Keep in mind, this value must be rounded up to the next power of 2. So valid values will be 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, so on and so on. Leads Shininess Mult. This changes the intensity of reflections when using the LCS or VCS pipeline. This is called Leads Shininess because Rockstar Leads developed Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories. Neo Shininess Mult. This changes the intensity of reflections when using the Neo pipeline. Neo Specularity Mult. This changes the intensity of the specular light on vehicles when using the Neo pipeline. I didn't notice a difference with anything over 1, but you can reduce or remove the specular lighting by lowering this value. ENV Shininess Mult. This changes the intensity of reflections when using the ENV pipeline. ENV Specularity Mult. This changes the intensity of the specular light on vehicles when using the ENV pipeline. ENV Power. This changes the power of the specular light on vehicles when using the ENV pipeline. The lower this value is, the more the vehicle will be covered by specular lighting. ENV Fresnel. This changes the intensity of the Fresnel lighting on vehicles. So that's all of the vehicle pipelines and their options. So what would I recommend? Honestly, this is entirely preference, but these are the settings that I like to use. So I use the Neo pipeline, I change ENV map size to 1024 to increase the resolution of the reflections. I change Neo Shininess Mult to 0.7 to slightly reduce the intensity of the reflections. And last, I changed Neo Specularity Mult to 0.5 to reduce the intensity of the specular lighting. Like I said, these are the settings I like to use. Again, it's entirely up to you. Experiment with the different pipelines and settings and see what you like. Sun Glare. This adds the sun glare effect from Vice City on vehicles, which is intended to simulate the sun shining off the body of the vehicle. I'd recommend turning this on, as I think it adds to the atmosphere of the game. Grass Add Ambient. This adds the current ambient light set in the weather file to the grass models, like on PS2. I'd recommend enabling this option. Grass Fix Placement. A random number generator bug causes the placement of grass to be wrong. This option fixes that. I'd recommend enabling this option. There's no real reason to disable it. Grass Backface Cull. This enables or disables backface culling on grass. If you don't know, backface culling is basically an optimization technique that will only render geometry that is facing the camera. On PS2, this was disabled, while on PC, it was enabled. I'd recommend disabling this, as it makes the grass look denser. If you have performance issues around grass, try enabling this. PED Shadows. This enables or disables the shadows on character models. By default, it's off, as the PS2 didn't have character shadows, and SkyGFX intends to mimic the PS2 by default. I'd recommend leaving this option blank. This will make it so the game's visual settings will decide whether or not pitch shadows are enabled, rather than SkyGFX. Stenciled shadows. These are the shadows used for vehicles and some generic objects around the map, like lampposts. Like before, I'd recommend leaving this blank for the same reasons. Stenciled shadows become visible on medium visual settings. Color filter. This setting probably impacts the atmosphere of the game the most, allowing you to change the color filter of the game. The PS2 color filter is set by default, and is probably the most iconic look, recreating the color filter seen on the original PS2 game. The PC color filter is the color filter seen in the vanilla PC game. The mobile color filter recreates the color seen in the mobile ports of San Andreas. And lastly, you can completely disable the color filter by setting this to none. This option also controls the look of the infrared goggles, night vision goggles, and also the grain that appears when raining. This grain also appears when using the infrared and night vision goggles. Like almost everything in this mod, what you choose is completely preference. I prefer the PS2 color filter when playing with the original Rockstar weather file, so this is what I'd recommend. However, the PS2 color filter won't work well with every weather mod, so if you're using a custom TimeCyc, make sure you set this back to the PC color filter, unless the mod author says otherwise. Use PC TimeCyc. This option requires a lot to talk about, so we'll cover that in the next chapter. Blur. The next 4 settings are for the intensity of the blur effect, which only works when using the PS2 color filter. The higher these values, the stronger the blur. This isn't the same as the motion blur seen when driving fast in vehicles. While the PS2 game has blur enabled, SkyGFX disables the blur by default, despite attempting to recreate the PS2 graphics. The reason for this is because the author thought people would prefer a crisper, cleaner look, and I guess you could only imagine the constant questions regarding how to disable the blur if it was left enabled. Leaving these 4 options blank will make the game use the blur values from Stream.ini instead, which would be the same values the PS2 game used. So if you want to recreate the entire PS2 look, just make these options blank. But personally, I'd recommend keeping them at 0 and disabling the blur entirely. Do radiosity. This enables or disables radiosity. Radiosity takes the highlights and boosts them even further, basically brightening the brightest areas on the screen, similar to bloom. It also applies a strong blur to these areas. Radiosity only worked on the PS2 version. Every other version had broken or unfinished code. Radiosity also works with all the color filters with SkyGFX. I'd recommend leaving this on, but as usual it's completely preference. Radiosity. This changes the implementation of the radiosity. The PS2 implementation doesn't scale well at higher resolutions, although I didn't notice too much of a difference myself. I'd recommend leaving this set to shader. Before we move on from radiosity, there's actually further fine tuning that you can do with these settings, so let's just skip to those options. These next 3 options are commented out by default, so if you are tweaking these, make sure you remove the semicolons next to them. Personally, I don't change these settings, so I can't recommend anything, but I'll cover them anyway. Radiosity filter passes. This is how often the frame will be downsampled, getting halved both horizontally and vertically. Radiosity render passes. This is how often radiosity will be rendered. Radiosity intensity. This is the intensity of the radiosity. This value is a multiplier. Disable clouds. This option disables the clouds seen on the horizon, as these are actually broken on PS2. I'd recommend leaving this option disabled. Disable gamma. This option stops the brightness slider in-game from affecting gamma. I can't display this as I can only see it on my own display. Gamma is only available when playing the game in full screen. If you play in windowed, you wouldn't see it anyway. I'd recommend keeping this enabled. Neo Water Drops. This brings the water droplets from the Xbox version of Vice City to the PC version of San Andreas. Here's the vanilla game during rainy weather. And here's rainy weather with Neo Water Drops enabled. The droplets also move with the camera and move faster down the screen while driving fast. Droplets will also appear when swimming, or driving a boat. I'd recommend enabling this. I personally think it looks fantastic. Neo Blood Drops. This brings the blood droplets from the Xbox version of Vice City to the PC version of San Andreas. The effect is basically the same as water droplets, except now it's red. This appears when the player is near splashes of blood or takes damage. I'd also recommend enabling this. Transparent Lock-On. This makes the lock-on user interface transparent like it was on the PS2. I think this looks better, so I'd recommend leaving this on. Lightning Illuminates World. This allows you to enable or disable whether lightning during stormy weather will light up models or just the sky like on PS2. I'd recommend enabling this. Fix PC Car Light. We'll cover this option alongside Use PC x CYC in the next chapter. Corona Z-Test. This enables or disables a forced Z-test on Coronas. The big change here is the Corona of the Sun, which now looks like the PS2 version where the Z-test is disabled. Fix Shadows. This attempts to fix the floating and clipping with low quality shadows. Unfortunately, this doesn't work great when using a high far clip. I'd recommend disabling this option as it's not perfect. So, let's go back to Use PC x CYC. Before we dive into this option, let's just talk about the .cyc file. If you don't know, the .cyc file on San Andreas is basically the weather file. It's located in the game's data folder. This file controls the sky color, the ambient color of the world, post-FX colors, etc. However, there's a few problems with the .cyc that comes with the PC version. The first is the fact that one line for a specific weather setting at a specific time is corrupt. The weather called Rainy Countryside is broken at 8 PM in game time. This is what it looks like on the PC version, and this is what it looks like on the PS2 version. The reason this happens is because Rockstar put 255 at the beginning of the line instead of 22, 22, 22, which causes the entire line to be read incorrectly, as it's basically missing two values at the start. The second problem is, the alpha channel for post-FX colors is set wrong. An alpha value of 1.0, which is full transparency, would be represented as a value of 128 on PS2 hardware and 255 on OpenGL or Direct3D hardware. On the PS2, the alpha value in the .cyc is set at 127 for post-FX colors, which is basically fully transparent. On PC, the alpha value in the .cyc is set at 255. The problem is, on all non-PS2 versions of San Andreas, Rockstar made it so this value will be multiplied by 2 when read, in order to convert the alpha value to standard range on other platforms. However, they possibly forgot they did this at some stage, and then set the alpha channel to 255 in the PC .cyc, which basically means the game is trying to multiply 255 by 2, which doesn't work because the standard range is 0 to 255. I didn't notice a visual difference because of this, but it's still wrong nonetheless. And the third issue with the PC .cyc is, it's missing the values for the intensity of directional light, also known as illumination, which appear on character models and vehicles. However, Rockstar must have noticed the lack of directional light in the PC version and decided to introduce a hard-coded light for vehicles in the PC vehicle pipeline. The problem with this is, if you use a PS2 TimeCYC on PC, it means vehicles will have the directional light from the TimeCYC, but they'll also have the hard-coded light if using the PC vehicle pipeline. This makes vehicles really bright. Thankfully, SkyGFX disables the hard-coded light via a configuration option, which is what Fixed PC Car Light actually does. With Fixed PC Car Light enabled, the hard-coded light in the PC vehicle pipeline gets removed, which means vehicles will no longer appear too bright when the direction light values are in the TimeCYC, which is the case with the PS2 TimeCYC. I'd recommend leaving Fixed PC Car Light enabled when using the PS2 TimeCYC, and disabling it when using the PC TimeCYC or a custom TimeCYC, although this setting is irrelevant if you're not using the PC vehicle pipeline. Keep in mind, Silent Patch also disables this hard-coded light and will actually enable directional lighting by default if the values are missing from the TimeCYC like they are in the PC file. So this really should make a difference assuming you're using that tool. So what does Use PC TimeCYC actually do? This option simply makes it so the game will no longer multiply the alpha channel values for PostFX colors, as the PC TimeCYC already has the values doubled by default. So if this is enabled while using the PS2 TimeCYC, you'll see the effect of a lower alpha channel value. As the PS2 TimeCYC has alpha channel values for PostFX colors at 127 like I said before. If you're using the PC TimeCYC, you really won't notice a visual difference with this enabled or disabled. The alpha channel values for PostFX colors in the PC TimeCYC are basically at the max value they can go anyway. While the game does multiply these values, it makes no difference visually. Okay, so that's all the problems with the TimeCYC file in San Andreas, and that's what the option does. So, should you enable or disable this option? Well, if you're using the PS2 TimeCYC, which I'd recommend, you should definitely leave this option commented out like it is by default. The PC version of the game comes with a PS2 TimeCYC already. Here's how you get it. Step 1. Go to your data folder and find TimeCYC p.dat. This is the PS2 TimeCYC file that was used for PAL regions on the PS2. It's unused on the PC version of the game. Step 2. Copy this file. Step 3. Go to your mod loader folder and create a new folder called PS2 TimeCYC. Open it and paste TimeCYC p.dat into this folder. Step 4. Rename the file and remove the P at the end. ModLoader will now load this TimeCYC instead of the one in your data folder. Okay, so that's every configuration option that you'll ever need to change covered in depth. So, if you've been following along and maybe using my recommended settings, what's the overall graphical difference? Well, let's take a look at some comparisons. There really isn't much difference between what I've recommended and the default PS2 settings, other than being a little bit darker, which I think is better as the brighter visuals can definitely make the map look very flat. The vehicle pipeline changes are also another standout, giving us nice reflections which still fit the look of San Andreas. And lastly, the addition of the Neo water drops and blood drops just make the game look that much better. And that's basically it for the configuration file. Again, this mod is all about customization. For most of these options, there's no right or wrong option. Pick what you think looks best. I'll leave a link to my own SkyGFX configuration file in the description with my recommended settings. There are also some fine tuning options that I didn't cover, as they're pretty self-explanatory. So what about performance? Now this isn't Digital Foundry, but I thought I'd do my best to give some insight to the performance impact when using SkyGFX and what settings will hit your system the most. These results will obviously vary depending on your system, but this should give some sort of indication of performance impact. Just for reference, this is my setup. The CPU is an i5-7600K at 4.5 GHz, the GPU is a GTX 1070, it has 16GB of RAM at 3200 MHz, the game is installed on a 500GB SATA SSD, and it's running on Windows 10 2.1H1. Keep in mind, San Andreas should really be played with frame limiter on. This is just to see the performance impact of the mod. Before we do a full benchmark, let's take a look at which configuration options may reduce performance the most. So we took a look at dual pass earlier, and I mentioned it could have a bit of a performance impact, but by how much? As we can see in this scene here, the average frame rate with dual pass disabled is around 125 frames per second. In the same scene with dual pass enabled, the average frame rate drops to around 104 frames per second. That's a 20% difference in average frame rate. I also tested whether increasing the Z-Write threshold setting for dual pass would change the performance, but it didn't seem to change anything. The frame rate still averages out at around 104 frames per second. Another configuration option I said could have an impact on performance was the backface culling option for grass. So let's take a look at how big of an impact this setting could potentially have. In this scene here, the average frame rate with backface culling disabled is around 75 frames per second. However, with backface culling enabled, the average frame rate jumps to around 105 frames per second. That's a 40% difference in average frame rate. So while the grass looks worse, you can definitely gain some performance here. If you want to gain even more performance, disabling dual pass will skyrocket the average frame rate to around 183 frames per second, but the grass won't look nearly as good. What about the vehicle pipeline? So while I do recommend the Neo pipeline for vehicles in this video, it is pretty heavy on performance. Let's take a look at all the vehicle pipelines to compare performance between them. The PS2 pipeline gives us an average frame rate of around 211. The PC pipeline is around 213. The Xbox pipeline is a slight increase at around 215. The spec pipeline brings us back down to around 211. This is basically the PS2 pipeline anyway, just with specular lighting. The mobile pipeline gives us a bit of a drop down to around 204. This is with an ENV map size of 1024. The Neo pipeline is where performance gets hit hard. At an ENV map size of 256, we average at 125 frames per second. At 1024, we average at 124 frames per second. And at 2048, we average 120 frames per second. The LCS and VCS pipelines are similar, giving us an average of around 134 each. The ENV pipeline brings us back up to an average frame rate of 201. This is with an ENV map size of 1024. So the Xbox pipeline gives us the highest average at 215. While the Neo pipeline causes the biggest decrease at around 120. Lastly, I also created a basic benchmark. This isn't perfect, as the San Andreas camera can behave differently because of the frame rate, but it gives an idea of the performance differences with different configuration files. I ran this benchmark 3 times for the default SkyGFX PS2 settings, the default SkyGFX PC settings, and I also ran it for my recommended settings. At the end, I'll share the results and we can see which had the best average frame rate. So that benchmark was performed 3 times for each configuration, and this is what I found. The default PS2 SkyGFX settings constantly had an average frame rate of 190 in all 3 runs. With the PC SkyGFX settings, all 3 runs basically had an average frame rate of 206, very little difference. And lastly, with my recommended SkyGFX settings, all 3 runs had an average frame rate of around 107. Again, very little difference. So my recommended SkyGFX settings are the slowest. The cause of this is pretty much down to using the Neo vehicle pipeline, which as we saw earlier, can be pretty taxing compared to all the other pipelines. The PS2 SkyGFX settings came in second, with around a 77% increase in average frame rate when compared to my recommended settings. And in fourth place was the default SkyGFX PC settings, which had a 91% increase in average frame rate when compared to my recommended settings. Again, this isn't a big deal, San Andreas should really be locked at 30 FPS anyway to avoid bugs, but I thought the results was interesting. How well does the mod work with San Andreas multiplayer? Well, in my testing, the mod does actually work pretty perfectly with SAMP. The colour filters change perfectly and so does the vehicle pipeline. Effects like the Neo water drops and blood drops also work perfect with SAMP. The GTA forums page for SkyGFX recommends using SAMP Graphic Restore if playing on SAMP. This mod has been renamed to SAMP Add-on since then. I'm not entirely sure if it's necessary as I didn't notice any problems in my short time testing, but if you experience any problems, try using that too. And so we come to an end. SkyGFX is one of the biggest achievements of San Andreas modding, restoring the PS2 graphics of San Andreas to the PC, and bringing a huge range of graphic options to the San Andreas engine from other GTA titles. I'd like to thank the author of this mod, App, for all his hard work over the years, and to everyone else who helped with this mod. App also has his own documentation for SkyGFX on his site, which goes more in depth regarding the technical details behind the mod. I'll link it below in the description. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a like. Join my Discord, follow me on Twitter, and subscribe to my channel for more content like this.